Hello, World History class. This is Mrs. Politsky, and we've got notes for Chapter 20, Section 3, Napoleon's Europe, and Chapter 20, Section 4, Napoleon's Fall and Europe's Reaction. So let's kind of get started here. It has been a very chaotic time in France. The French Revolution, which was going on for about 10 years, brought pure chaos to that nation. Shortly after some of the deaths through the Reign of Terror, France installed a government known as the Directory. And it was governed by 5 directors who, for the most part, did nothing but quarrel and who were incredibly unpopular by the people, leaving France in a state where it was very chaotic, opening the door to the rise of a military dictator. And so we're going to talk about this guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon came to power through what is known as a coup d'etat. He accomplished his coup d'etat during an unannounced return to France during a politically uncertain time. Just so you know, Napoleon was roughly 30 years of age at the time that this all took place. What ends up happening is 3 of the directors automatically resigned power. 2 others who were not necessarily wanting Napoleon to come to power were eventually arrested by the French military. So to kind of give you a little background on this guy named Napoleon, I want to tell you a few little things here, not necessarily things that you need to write down, but Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica. Corsica is actually kind of out in the Mediterranean Sea, and it's south of France, kind of close to the country of Italy as well. He was born there in 1769. At roughly the age of 9 or 10, his mom and dad sent him off to military school. And he graduated from that military school at the age of 16, promptly going into the military as an officer, as a lieutenant, with the specialty of artillery. This is going to be kind of Napoleon's calling card when we talk about his military accomplishments. The artillery is kind of his signature, if you want to call it that. By the time he was 24, he was a general. And by the time he was 26, he was in charge of the entire French military. His enemies never have really given Napoleon probably the credit he deserves. He's always been portrayed as short. Some accounts say that he was about 5'2", but truth is 5'2" back at the beginning of the 19th century was probably average height for a lot of men. He was very vain, domineering, incredibly ambitious. Uh, when we talk about the British, who were probably one of Napoleon's biggest enemies, they had a little saying for him. They called him the Little Corporal. So nevertheless, he certainly didn't have a lot of friends throughout Europe. Let's just put it that way. When Napoleon gained power of the government, he established himself a dictatorship within France. And I think that's one of the things that has always been kind of the cautionary tale about Napoleon. Uh, Granted, democracy was something that I think those people who were involved in the French Revolution had wanted, but democracy is not always easy to achieve. And if you want clear decisiveness, unfortunately, a dictatorship really does have a tendency to kind of get things done very rapidly. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that did take place during Napoleon's time as the leader of France. Probably one of the most famous things that he did as the leader was to come up with a code of laws. You got to remember the French Revolution, things were really chaotic. There were, obviously a lot of people who were killed as a result of some of the infighting that was happening there. But he was able to take the law and to kind of, clarify it. He set up a code of criminal law, a code of commercial law, and for the most part, that's still the law of France. This code, for the most part, made the laws clear and consistent. It was based on the ideas of equality and toleration, which is kind of interesting considering that Napoleon is a dictator. But he also did other things. He centralized the government, and that's kind of easy to do when you're a dictator. He took command of the army and the navy. Again, easy to do when you're a dictator. He established the Bank of France. He established public education, and we're not just talking, for elementary and secondary students, but all the way up through the universities. He, at times, was interested in redesigning the city of Paris into a great um, world city, and he worked on works of architecture, designing boulevards and rues, which are basically their streets and avenues. For the most part, he really did a lot in a very short period of time, but he also kind of was a warmonger, and that's what we're going to talk about. Um, as you can see here, there's a photograph or a painting here of Napoleon. In 1802, he made himself emperor for life. And it was kind of a weird deal. There was a coronation that took place at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and the Pope came up from Rome, from the Vatican, to actually crown him emperor. And what's interesting is Napoleon, at the time that the Pope was about ready to put the crown on his head, Napoleon gets up, swaps the crown, and puts the crown on his own head. And you can kind of see this. There's a painting of the coronation of Napoleon. He's got the crown in his hand, and he's about ready to plop it down on his head. Napoleon and the Catholic Church, I would have to say, did have a tendency to butt heads at times. Um, One of the things that we know is that, out of the French Revolution, there was still kind of this distrust of Catholics because of their ties with the monarchy. And since Napoleon, during the time of the French Revolution, he was, kind of fighting the monarchs for the most part. One of the things that kind of came out of that revolution was this belief of religious tolerance. And I would have to say that during his time as dictator, that probably continued on, that one idea of the French Revolution. So let's talk about some battles. Napoleon was kind of known for loving to go to war. Matter of fact, during his time in power, we have a series of wars that are attributed to his name, the Napoleonic Wars, that basically last roughly 15 years, from about 1800 to about 1815. Napoleon, for the most part, pretty much invaded all of his neighbors in all of France's neighbors, including Egypt as well. As a matter of fact, if you look at pictures of the Sphinx, there's a lot of stories about the fact that Napoleon's artillerymen used that as target practice. But there are a couple of big battles that I want to talk about. The first one is this one in number 4 in 1804, the Battle of Trafalgar, which was a big battle for the most part with France and Spain taking their naval fleets and putting them together, going against the British, with the hope that, maybe Napoleon could crush the British at this moment, because the British were kind of like his big enemy in his mind. And at this battle, um, a man named General Horatio Nelson, who was the head of the British Navy at this point in time, takes his slightly smaller fleet against the French and the Spanish and destroys them. But also in the process of destroying the French and the Spanish, he also dies in this battle. And he's attributed for saying that to his men that England expects that every man will do his duty. And in the course of the battle, he prepares a will, and he dies in the battle as a great hero, and for the most part, avenges any possibility that the French are ever going to be able to muster an invasion of England. Kind of squashes that at that moment in time. As a result, Napoleon kind of gets revenge, and he sets up a economic blockade of Great Britain called the Continental System, which he ordered all of Europe's nations to participate in, or else go to battle against you. And so, shortly after that Battle of Trafalgar, we have another major decisive battle known as the Battle of Austerlitz that takes place actually in the same year in 1805. And sometimes it's known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. You had France and Napoleon, and then you had Russia and Austria. And this is one of those defining battles in Napoleon's legacy. He is probably outnumbered, but at the same time, he wins the day with a lot of really interesting military maneuvers, and in a sense, is a force to be reckoned with throughout Europe. All right, moving into section 4, talking about Napoleon's fall and Europe's reaction. Napoleon, he didn't have a lot of friends in Europe. And at some point in time, he decides that um, the Russians, who had at one point in time been part of the continental system, they were backing out of it, that they were ripe for invasion. Okay, and because of the fact that they withdrew from the continental system, he felt like he had to go in there and show them, his disapproval of that. So he decides to invade Russia, which was a complete disaster. And number 2 here, this invasion was a disaster due to a lot of weird coincidences. There had been a fire in Moscow, and this wasn't like an accidental thing. This was actually a fire that was set on purpose, sometimes known as a scorched earth policy. As Napoleon troops were marching in to Russia, as a matter of fact, they were kind of marching in kind of late in the season when we talk about warfare, kind of late summer, moving into fall, eventually into winter. They show up in Moscow, and they're probably in need of supplies. And what the Russians do is they set fire to anything that would have been of value to the French army and left them nothing as they kind of retreat. Napoleon could have backed out as the Russian winter set in, but he did not retreat. And hence his men were starting to get very cold and very hungry. And then eventually the winter sets in, and what we end up having is a complete disaster for the French military. Men are freezing to death, they're going hungry. It just is a morale nightmare for the great Napoleon. So this becomes a real issue back home in France. There are a lot of people that are really upset with him, and hence this kind of leads to his downfall. The failed Russian invasion led to Napoleon's downfall because his army was practically destroyed, and his enemies took advantage of this opportunity. Actually, in 1813, Napoleon steps down, and the leaders of uh, Europe, for the most part, they send him to the island of Elba, which is a little island off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean Sea. And he's there for a little while, but he kind of gets the urge to go back. And in 1815, he escapes from Elba, ends up back in France, musters together a new army, and is on the rampage. And then it happens on June 18th, 1815. Napoleon is finally going to be defeated at what is known as the Battle of Waterloo. You had the armies of Prussia, which is basically like modern day Germany, Great Britain, the Netherlands, all under the control of this guy named the Duke of Wellington. Just so you know, he is English, he's British. They meet and they have this great battle, and Napoleon is crushed. Hence, he meets his Waterloo, which is kind of a little analogy for failure. If you've ever heard that before. And as a result, he is sent away again. Okay, this time he's sent to the island of St. Helena. St. Helena is really an island off the coast of Africa, kind of due west of the country of Angola. We're almost right smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And he stays there until 1821 when he dies. And a lot of times people have gone through and they talk about how crushed of a man he was and destroyed and such. So nevertheless, the rise and fall of the great Napoleon. As a result of all of this, our European leaders convene a major peace conference. And this actually begins as a result of Napoleon's first exile. This conference is known as the Congress of Vienna, held in Vienna, Austria, in late 1814. This is during the time that Napoleon is in Elba. and then almost to the point of time when he escapes and prepares for the Battle of Waterloo. After all the debate at the Congress of Vienna, the Congress is formed, agrees to form what is known as alliances or agreements among their representatives, with the whole idea that, if everybody kind of teams up, that at some point in time, no one's going to want to go to war. The irony is, for a short period of time, we don't have a ton of wars. I mean, there are going to be some wars that are going to happen within Europe, primarily those between um, Prussia or the German states and France, and a lot of it is over the borders between those two nations. But for the most part, we're going to have a period of peace. And that's probably one of the greatest things that comes out of this Congress of Vienna. Shortly after that, we have one of the big alliances that kind of manifests itself. And eventually we're going to have an alliance of Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, which is kind of like the German states, and eventually France is going to become this. And they're going to be known as the Quadruple Alliance. Okay, and this Quadruple Alliance, what I think is interesting about it is, maybe with the exception of Austria and Prussia, this is going to be a great opportunity for France and Great Britain to actually become friendly. And what's going to be interesting is, as we go into the 20th century, France and Great Britain have a tendency to be on the same side, whereas Prussia and Austria, for a couple of world wars, are also going to be on the same side. All right, I hope that you got everything written down. Thank you.